We've agonized a little bit as to what we ought to do for this video portion of our family reunion. And we finally decided that rather than do something funny,
Which I wouldn't do very well.
we thought we would take this opportunity to tell the story of our love story.
Our real love story.
And although some of you know the details, some of the younger ones probably will not, and there ought to be a record of this, I suspect. I'm going to let Mom start out, and she can talk about how we finally got together and met each other, and I'll fill in some details as we move along.
Okay, I'll take these off so there won't be a glare, even though you're used to seeing me with my glasses on. Well, I went to BYU and graduated and started teaching school in Salt Lake, and I was living in Dad's home ward while he was on his mission. But I had a missionary also who was serving in southern Germany. Dad was in northern Germany, and this missionary was in southern Germany. I had met him at BYU, and nothing had been decided before he left on his mission, but I had thought that I'd probably marry him. And when he came home the end of March 1963, I met him at the airport with his parents, and it was nice to see him. And the following week, he'd started going to BYU, so he came up to see me in Salt Lake, and he surprised me with a diamond ring. I wasn't ready for that at that time. Even though I'd written to him for 2.5 years, it just wasn't right. It didn't feel like, and it took him all weekend to talk me into keeping the ring. And I kept the ring for a month. I wore it for a month and tried to give it back twice, and he wouldn't take it back, and I just wasn't sure. He's a really fine person. There was nothing wrong with him, but I just didn't feel like it was right. And I did a lot of fasting and praying about it. And finally, after a long fast, I just knew that I wasn't supposed to marry him. Here I was, graduated from BYU, teaching school. Where was I going to meet anybody? But I just knew that I wasn't supposed to marry him. I had gone to Dad's homecoming. The week after my missionary came home was Dad's homecoming, or he came home, and then his homecoming was the following week on General Conference, and I was so impressed with the talk that he gave, you can imagine, but I heard that he had a girlfriend then too. Well, I also met Dad another time when my missionary had come to church with me, and then after church I was visiting with the bishop, and Dad and my missionary talked together, and as we got in the car, my missionary said, "Well, he's really impressed with you." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Some guys get all the luck." I said, "Why would he say that? He doesn't even know me." But as I did give the ring back to this friend, he said, "Well, is there anyone else?" And I said, "No, there's no one else." And then I said, "I'd like to go with Glenn Roylance." I don't know why. I just felt like I'd like to go with Glenn Roylance.
Now, let me jump in at this point and bring you up to speed on my half of this story. I had dated a girl at BYU before leaving on my mission, and we left each other with the agreement that she would probably wait for me, and that if things worked out when I got home, that we would probably go ahead and get married. But it was not a formal engagement by any imagination. Well, at the close of my mission, I had fully assumed that this was going to end up in a marriage relationship. I came home with that full expectation. But things just didn't feel right as we commenced that relationship further, and finally it became apparent that I had to make a decision as to what I was going to do. There was someone else interested in her, and she was torn at this point, not knowing exactly what my feelings were towards her. And so I made the long trek from Salt Lake City to her home in Idaho, somewhat north of the area where Mom comes from, Idaho Falls to be exact. And I went with the idea of exploring the possibility of a proposal to see what her feelings might be in this regard. I remember taking the family car and driving my mother as far as Pocatello, Idaho, and leaving her there. And then I went on to...
She was visiting her brother.
Yes. And then I went on to Idaho Falls. We had a lengthy conversation that evening, and what I had fully expected to be or anticipated to be a wonderfully romantic evening didn't quite work out that way. It was cold and snowy, and it was a
Not
very
supposed to be.
unromantic circumstance. But more than that, as we talked about marriage, it became apparent to me that we didn't look at life, particularly marriage and love and even some spiritual things, the way that that could have brought about a full unity in our relationship. And some things that we talked about that night, we probably had never talked about in that kind of a serious conversation prior. As the evening drew to the close, it was very late, and I remember I was sharing a bedroom with her brother. He was sound asleep, and as I knelt that evening to offer my evening prayers, I poured out my heart, fully aware that he was sound asleep and that this was indeed a private prayer, and expressed my feelings of reservation. And there came at that point a wonderful peace that suggested that even though this was a good relationship and that there had been feelings of tenderness here, that this was not the kind of a relationship that would sustain a marriage for the rest of my life. The next day, as we visited, I suggested that we break off our relationship, and she agreed. And even though that was done very easily, without a whole lot of emotional fanfare, it was nevertheless very difficult. And I remember driving home and then stopping to pick up my mother in Idaho Falls and sharing those in Pocatello, and sharing those details with her, and just agonizing over this emptiness that I felt after having been connected in spirit and in heart feelings with someone for that length of time. As we drove through the area surrounding this little community of Downey, Idaho, my mother said, there's a young lady that is in our ward who comes from this little community, and her father is the stake president here. And oddly enough, at that very moment, the impression came to me, this is the one that you're going to marry. And even though I had met her briefly, I did not log that in my memory as to who she was and what the connection was. There were a number of people that I did not know that evening at the time I made my homecoming report. But I went home with the full anticipation that I would date this Carol Criddle. Little did I know that she was engaged. And then, of course,
I broke the engagement.
She had broken the engagement.
And then after I had broken the engagement, I went to church on Sunday, and I sat next to his mother in choir, and she said, because Glenn had met him the week before, she said, well, Glenn met your fiancé and said he's a fine young man. And I said, yes, he is a fine young man, but he's not my fiancé anymore. So she went home and told him. And
I didn't waste any time making arrangements for a date. Oddly enough, at this very time, I had received a phone call from an old high school teacher that I had been quite close to. And she,
old is right. She was an old maid.
Yes. And she was a sponsor for an Arab club at the University of Utah campus, and had been providing some financial support for that organization. And she had some tickets to an Arab club dinner dance that was going to be quite an event on campus. And she said, if you think you could get a date, I'll give you 2 complimentary tickets. Well, that worked out just beautifully. And so with, I should say, the most unusual of circumstances, an Arab club dinner dance, we had our first date. But as odd as that may sound, it was a wonderful evening, even though there was some Arab music. Most of it was Western traditional, by Western I mean swing music from the United States, and we discovered that we could dance very well together. I was amazed at her ability to follow my lead.
And I've been following ever since.
Yes. And the food was wonderful. It was a wonderful evening. And following that dinner dance, and it was quite late.
Yeah.
We stayed until the end. We stopped at a little root beer stand not too far from home. There we talked for another couple of hours. And that was perhaps one of the most significant conversations I had ever had so far as dating relationships were concerned.
One thing that he said in that time we were visiting, he said that the girl that he married would have to meet three requirements. First, she would have to love the Lord, she would have to love him, and she'd have to understand priesthood government in the home. Well, I knew that I could meet that first requirement. I loved the Lord, and I felt like I loved him too, even though we'd only had a date that first night. I just felt a love for him. And I didn't know what he meant by priesthood government in the home, but where my dad had been the stake president for so many years, and I'd seen how my mother had supported him and how he had blessed our family with the priesthood, I thought, I can do that. And so I thought, well, I can meet those requirements.
Yes, I too had the sense that this was going to end in an engagement. It wasn't long. We had
That was on Friday, and on Sunday he invited me to come to his home for dinner, which was very nice to meet with his mother and father and Robert, have dinner, and then we went down to the Temple Square and went on a tour around the Temple Square. And as I stood and looked up at the temple, I thought, I'd love to go through that temple and be sealed to you. I really thought that.
It's a good beginning.
That was our second date.
And as we then drove home, pulled up in front of her little apartment, and it was a basement apartment, and even though I was not in the habit of exchanging kisses on the second date, it happened, and it was a good one.
It was.
And I turned to her and I said, I hope you don't think that I always kiss girls on the second date. And she assured me that this was no problem for her. She invited me in, and we then looked at a collection of pictures and of stories having to do with her childhood. It was called her Treasures of Truth book.
The only journal I've ever kept, a scrapbook kind of thing that I had kept from all my growing up years.
It was full of letters, and some of them were from teachers and friends, and full of photographs and articles from the newspaper. And I discovered that this was a very, very bright young lady. Among other things, she had been a part of an academic honorary sorority at BYU, and had graduated with honors, was the salutatorian of her class,
Of the College of Family Living.
and had spoken at the commencement
Right.
exercises. And then as I thumbed through all of this material, I came to the closing pages of this Treasures of Truth book, and there was a copy of her patriarchal blessing. And I said to her, do you mind if I read this? And she said, no, go right ahead. And I was moved as I read those promises, and it was almost as if it was a window that opened into her soul. And then I turned to her as I concluded reading her blessing, and I said, what would you say if I asked you to marry me?
And I said, if you were to ask me, I'd probably say yes.
Well, that constituted a almost proposal. The following weekend, which was Mother's Day, why don't you go ahead and explain?
This was the first Mother's Day in my family without my mother, because she had passed away in the fall before. And so my sisters and I went home to prepare dinner and be with my father and two younger brothers for Mother's Day without mother. And I invited him to come, and he left his mother, whom he had been away from for the past 2 years, and he came up to meet my family.
Her sisters had made every effort to make this a lovely experience
I helped.
for Dad, being first Mother's Day without Mother. And the table was set just as their mother would have set the table, and the food was delicious. And then as the conversation waned, as the afternoon wore on, finally somebody said, "Daddy, would you sing that song?" And he said, "I suppose it'd be all right." And he got up and he went over to the mantelpiece and he took off a picture of his deceased wife and held it in his arms, cradled it in his arms, and then sang a love song. And it became apparent that this was something that had happened almost as a tradition in that home. It was a wonderful moment, and there were tears in most of our eyes as he completed. And then somebody said, "Let's all sing." And we gathered around the piano and
I played the piano.
and we sang. It was a wonderful spirit of family unity. And the Spirit whispered to me and said, "If you marry this woman, this is the kind of a family you'll have, and this is the kind of family life you'll enjoy." And that has proven to be very, very true. Well, we'll just jump now to the close of all of this. It was that afternoon on the highway, traveling back, that I turned to her and said, "Don't you think that we ought to set a date?" And then she said, "Yes, of course, but you'll have to ask Daddy for permission."
The reason we were coming through Logan, because after our family get-together and dinner and everything, my dad had left to go down to Logan to visit a a lady that he had been courting. And I wanted to meet her. This is Alda that was your grandma that you're familiar with. But we went down so that I could meet her. And I said that he'd have to ask permission from Daddy.
Well, as I spoke with him, a little bit experiencing some consternation in the process, I asked him if I could marry his daughter. And then he said, "Do you love her?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I do." And then he turned to her and he said, "Do you love him?"
And I said, "Yes, Daddy, I do." And this was significant because there had been other people that had expressed love to me, and I used to wonder, how do you ever know when you're in love? And I used to ask my parents, my father and mother, I'd say, "How do you know when you're in love?" And my dad would say, "Well, you'll just know." So when he asked me that and I said, "Yes, I do," it was significant because I really did then, and I do now, love Daddy.
Well, and then that evening, I remember as we were having sacrament meetings in the evening at that time, and we went to evening sacrament meeting, and a member of the bishopric who saw me sitting with her thought he would just plant a little suggestion in my mind. He said, "You know, she's a lovely girl. You ought to really pursue a relationship with her."
And we
Little
were
did
engaged.
he know that we were engaged.
Didn't have a ring for another month, but we were engaged. This was Mother's Day in 1963, and we were married July 19th, 1963. So it wasn't just barely over 2 months
That's right.
that we were engaged.
And it was a wonderful time. Let me just quickly say this. During that period of our engagement, each evening that we were together, we would talk our way through a list of some 20 or 25 questions having to do with how we were going to establish our marriage, what the guiding principles would be, everything from family finances to relationships with in-laws and family traditions, and how we would celebrate Christmas, and how we would hold family home evenings, and all of these things. And we committed to ourselves how we were going to do this, and there were no surprises when we got married. We just pretty well followed those plans that we had set in place, and it has been a wonderful life. And
It has been wonderful life.
we want you to know we're going to make it. We've got.
It was 48 years on the 19th, and we were married in the Salt Lake Temple. And it's just been a glorious, glorious time.
And when I said we're going to make it, we've got the 50th.
In 2 years,
In
and
2
we're
years.
we're looking forward to eternity together.
Yes.